Here's the truth about Day 5 of Raiders camp, and I need you to sit with this for a second before I get into the details. What happened on that practice field today is going to change conversations in that building, and probably a few conversations in that quarterback room and along that offensive line too. I've been going through everything that came out of camp, cross-referencing what different reporters saw, and I keep landing on the same two stories pulling in opposite directions. On one side, you've got an offense that looked like it was playing on a different difficulty setting than the defense. On the other side, buried underneath all that scoring, there's a lineman who just put himself in a very uncomfortable spotlight, and not the good kind. So let's walk through this the right way, because there's a lot more going on here than just the offense had a good day. First, let's set the scene properly. This wasn't a normal mixed bag practice where you get a little bit of everything. The staff loaded today with red zone work, rep after rep from inside the 20, which means every single throw, every single handoff, every single rep carried weight. There's no room to hide in that part of the field. You're either finishing or you're not. And when you stack the deck with that many scoring opportunities, sure, you're going to see touchdowns pile up. That's just math. But even with that context in mind, even knowing the sample was tilted toward offense, what I watched unfold today still stopped me in my tracks. Because this wasn't just a few touchdowns happened. This was an offense that looked locked in, rhythmic, and dangerous in a way that should genuinely worry whoever's lining up against them come September. Let's start with the throws, because Kirk Cousins put together the kind of session that reminds everybody exactly why this organization brought him in. Multiple touchdown passes, ball spread around to different targets, decision-making that looked sharp and instinctive rather than hesitant. And look, I know there's been noise, there's been chatter, there's been doubt hanging over that quarterback room since the offseason. Days like this are the answer to that chatter. He connected with Brock Bowers not once but twice for scores, and both throws had that effortless veteran timing to them, the kind where you can tell the quarterback already knew where his tight end was going to be before the route even broke. But it wasn't just Bowers. He found Jalen Nailor in the end zone too, and he got Trey Tucker involved enough that Tucker actually became part of the other headline of the day, which I'll get to in a second. Here's the part that really stood out to me though, and I think it says more about Cousins than any of the touchdowns did. During a 7-on-7 period, Darian Porter got just enough of his hand on a pass intended for Trey Tucker to knock it off its path, and Taron Johnson was sitting right there to read it and jump the route for the interception. That's a real defensive play. That's a veteran corner and a heads-up nickel defender combining to make a quarterback pay for a split-second miscalculation. And I want you to think about how a lot of quarterbacks respond after something like that. Some guys get tentative. Some guys start second-guessing every throw for the rest of the period. Cousins didn't blink. He came right back onto the field and started slinging touchdowns to Nailor, to Tucker, and to Bowers. That response, that refusal to let one bad rep snowball into a bad practice, that's exactly the kind of mental toughness you want to see from the guy running your offense. It's a small moment in the grand scheme of a training camp, but small moments like that are how you actually evaluate a quarterback's temperament, not just his arm talent. Now let's talk about Fernando Mendoza for a second, because I don't want his day to get completely buried under the Cousins and Bowers headlines. Mendoza is getting legitimate run in these red zone reps, and that matters. That's not a courtesy rotation. That's meaningful development time for a guy who's still growing into this league. He connected with Nailor for a touchdown of his own, and then he threaded a back shoulder throw to Malik Benson that, on the tape, looked like a touchdown. Benson made a genuinely difficult sideline catch. Both hands, clean control, the kind of grab that gets people talking. Officials ruled it out of bounds, so it didn't count on the stat sheet. But I want to be clear about something. The boundary ruling doesn't erase what that rep showed us. The touch on that throw was there. The timing was there. For a young quarterback still building trust with his coaching staff and his teammates, that's exactly the kind of rep you point to on film and say, keep doing that and the results will follow. What I find encouraging about all of this is that the starter isn't hoarding every good look in these sessions. There's real development happening behind him, and in a league where injuries and inconsistency can force a backup into the lineup with zero notice, that matters more than people realize. Which brings me to the receiver room, because I think this might genuinely be one of the more underrated storylines coming out of camp right now. Everybody wants to talk about the tight end, and I'll get there, trust me. But look at what the receivers did today. Malik Benson making a difficult, contested sideline catch against real coverage. Trey Tucker drawing enough attention from the quarterback that he ended up being the target on the one big defensive play of the day. Jalen Nailor getting more involved than a lot of outside evaluators expected coming into this camp, and actually hauling in a touchdown. None of these guys are walking away from today as the headline, and that's sort of the point. When your receiver room is deep enough that multiple guys can make plays in the same practice without anyone needing to force the ball to just one option, that's a real luxury for a play caller. It gives you answers on third down. It gives you answers in the red zone when the primary read is covered. If these young receivers keep stacking days like this one throughout camp, I think people are going to walk into the season underestimating just how many weapons this offense actually has, and that's a mistake defensive coordinators are going to pay for in real games. Okay, now let's get to the guy who I think is quietly becoming the single most important piece of this entire offense. And I mean that literally, not as some kind of hot take for the sake of a hot take. Brock Bowers had his way with the defense today, and I say that with zero exaggeration. Multiple different reports out of camp independently describe the same thing, a tight end who simply could not be handled in coverage, from the start of practice to the finish. And here's where I'm going to say something that might get some pushback, so stick with me. I think by the end of this season, Brock Bowers is not just the best tight end in the entire league statistically. I think he ends up being the single most valuable offensive weapon on this entire roster, full stop, ahead of even Ashton Jeanty. I know that's a bold claim to make about a rookie running back who was drafted with that much fanfare and that much expectation. But when I watch the tape, when I watch how effortlessly Bowers separates, how naturally the ball finds him, how much stress he puts on a defense just by existing in the formation, I can't talk myself out of that conclusion. Here's the thing I'm going to be watching closest heading into preseason, and it's not whether Bowers keeps producing, because I think that's basically a foregone conclusion at this point. It's how Clint Kubiak actually chooses to deploy him. Does he keep Bowers anchored in a traditional inline role, using him primarily as an extension of the run game and a security blanket over the middle? Or does he start moving him around the formation like a true receiver, stacking him in the slot, motioning him out wide, forcing linebackers and safeties to declare who's covering him before the snap even happens? If Bowers really is going to be the focal point of this offense, and everything I'm seeing tells me he is, then my instinct says Kubiak starts scheming him all over the field. That's how you maximize a player with this kind of versatility. You don't just hand him a job description and leave him there. You use him as a chess piece, and you dare the defense to solve a puzzle that doesn't have a clean answer. Now, understanding Kubiak's overall philosophy actually unlocks a bigger storyline that I think is going to be one of the most fascinating things to track all season, and that's the running back situation. Let's get the obvious part out of the way first. Ashton Jeanty is the starter. Nobody's debating that. Nobody should debate that. He earned that role, and he's going to carry the bulk of the workload. But here's what I dug into, and it changed how I'm thinking about this backfield. If you look back at Kubiak's last two stops as a play caller, the backup running back in both situations actually outscored the starter in total touchdowns. Not by a landslide, and it wasn't some dramatic workhorse versus afterthought split either. It was closer to a genuine rotation, where the lead back got the bulk of the carries, but the second option still carved out real meaningful opportunities, especially in scoring situations. So when I look at Jeanty and Mike Washington through that lens, I'm not projecting Jeanty to just run away with something like 300 carries this season. I think it's going to look more like Jeanty handling the majority of the workload, somewhere in that 200-plus carry range, while Washington still carves out a legitimate, meaningful role behind him rather than sitting as a pure emergency option. And today actually gave us a preview of exactly that dynamic. Washington flashed real juice, breaking off a few nice runs during the session, including one that found its way into the end zone and red zone work. Keep an eye on that backfield split as camp rolls forward, because I don't think it's going to be nearly as one-sided as a lot of people are currently assuming. If Kubiak's history tells us anything, this is a coach who spreads the football to his playmakers regardless of position, and that philosophy applies just as much to the backfield as it does to the tight end room. Alright, now let's get into the part of today's practice that genuinely stuck with me the most, because while everybody's going to be talking about touchdowns and Bowers highlights, I think the real story of day 5 happened up front on the offensive line, and it's not a good news story. According to the reports coming out of camp, Spencer Burford and Jackson Powers-Johnson handled the majority of first-team reps at the two-guard spots today. I want to stress the word majority there, because it wasn't every single rep. Caleb Rogers has also been working his way into meaningful snaps at right guard, and honestly, that surprised me a little when I first heard it. Coming into camp, if you'd asked me to rank Burford against Powers-Johnson, I probably would have told you Powers-Johnson was the better player of the two. Full stop. No real hesitation. He's got the pedigree, he's got the physical tools, and he was someone a lot of people expected to just lock down that spot without much of a fight. But based on what's actually happening on the practice field right now, it's starting to look like this coaching staff feels Burford is more comfortable, more locked into the scheme, more trustworthy in his assignments at this exact moment than Powers-Johnson is. And that's not a small thing to say about a player with his level of draft capital and expectation attached to him. Here's where it gets genuinely concerning, and I want to walk through this carefully because I don't want to overstate it, but I also don't want to downplay it either. There's chatter coming directly from people who've actually been at these practices in person, watching this stuff live rather than piecing it together secondhand, and the word going around is that Powers Johnson has been whiffing on blocks. Not just getting beat by a good rep from a defender, but actually missing assignments outright, including at least one specific instance where he clearly saw the defender coming, had every opportunity to adjust, and still didn't get the job done. Some of that same chatter is suggesting he could be in real danger of losing his starting job entirely if this trend continues. Now, I want to be fair here because it's still relatively early in camp, and there's a real chance this ends up being nothing more than some rust that gets shaken off once the pads come on and things get more physical and more instinctive again. But I'd be doing you a disservice if I brush past this, because when a former high draft pick starts generating this kind of chatter this early in camp, that's exactly the kind of storyline that tends to snowball if it isn't corrected quickly. And it's not just word of mouth either. There's actual video circulating from one of these line drills with the offensive line coach working directly with this group, and watching it lays out exactly what I've been describing. Caleb Rogers is out there working angles on what looks like an outside zone concept, and he's driving his defender well off the screen, generating real visible movement. The backup right tackle in that same drill is showing real push of his own. The starting center is getting good movement on his rep. Even one of the rookie linemen flashes a solid, clean rep in that group. And then the tape gets to Jackson Powers Johnson on that exact same drill, and there's no push at all. Nothing. Now, I'm not sitting here trying to tell you that one rep in one drill is some kind of season-defining, career-altering moment, because it's obviously not that dramatic in isolation. But when you line up rep after rep like this, and the gap in results is that noticeable compared to the guys around him, that's not something you can just wave off as a fluke either. Honestly, when I step back and look at everything happening up front right now, I don't think this offensive line is going to look the same in week 1 as it does today, and I actually think that's a good thing for this team long term. You've got real legitimate competition brewing. Burford, Powers Johnson, Rogers, and Thayer Munford are all mixed into this battle in some form, and it wouldn't shock me at all if we see multiple changes to that starting 5 over the first few weeks of the regular season as this coaching staff continues figuring out their best combination. And Munford himself is a name worth watching closely here too, because he's already working at center with the second team group, and he's even picking up reps at right guard with the third team. That kind of positional flexibility, especially this early in camp, tells me he might be climbing this depth chart faster than a lot of outside observers currently expect. Versatile linemen who can bounce between multiple spots tend to earn trust quickly from coaching staffs, especially in a scheme that's still being installed and refined. So here's where I land after digging through everything from day 5. This offense has real juice, genuine juice, not the kind of hollow training camp optimism that evaporates the second the pads come on. Brock Bowers is already a legitimate problem for opposing defenses to solve, and I don't think that's going to change once real football starts. The receiver room is deeper and more capable than a lot of people gave it credit for heading into this camp. And this G.T. Washington backfield rotation is shaping up to be one of the more genuinely fun storylines to track as the season builds, especially if Kubiak's tendencies from his previous stops hold true here. But that offensive line, and specifically that right guard battle, that's the storyline I'm watching most closely as we head into the next handful of practices. Because everything I just described on offense, the touchdowns, the rhythm, the explosive plays, all of it depends on what happens up front. A dangerous passing game and a dynamic backfield rotation can only do so much if the group protecting them can't hold their ground consistently. Once the pads actually come on, and this stops being a controlled, largely non-contact setting, we're going to find out fast who up front is genuinely ready for that jump and who still has real work left to do. That transition is always when training camp battles get separated from training camp hype, and right now, that right guard spot feels like the clearest example of a competition that's still very much unsettled. I'll be back soon with more updates as camp continues to unfold, because if Day 5 told us anything, it's that this team still has a lot of layers left to reveal before the real games start counting.